Welcome to this week's lesson at Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to tell you about bishops and knights. As you can see in the position on the screen, that's all we have other than pawns and kings. Well, as we know, some basic things about bishops and knights. Bishops are great when there are big distances to be covered. That is, when there is action on both sides of the board. There are pawns on both sides of the board. Knights, on the other hand, while they can jump around, they can cover both black and white colored squares, they are much slower pieces. Well, those are the very basic general things to know about the two pieces. But let's talk about some more specifics. And let's start with this endgame that was played by one of the best endgame players of all time, Anatoly Karpov, versus the Czech Grandmaster Vlastimil Hort. In this position, White has a clear, visible advantage for several reasons. On one hand, Black has an isolated pawn on d5 that is beautifully blocked by the white knight in front of it on d4. Also, you can notice that Black has, in addition to the d5 pawn that's blocked, two other pawns on the same color square as their bishop on c8. That means that an exchange of bishop for the knight on f6 would also improve White's chances, because imagine if this knight on f6 disappears and so would the bishop on b1, the black bishop would be greatly limited by his own pawns being on the same color square as the bishop. Let's see how Karpov continued here. As we know, unlike in the opening or the middle game, the king can be and should be an active participant. And that's why Karpov continued moving the king towards the middle of the board. Now you may say, but wait a minute, White has double pawns, isn't that a disadvantage? Well, it may be at some point, but at the same time, those pawns can advance, and eventually White has a potential to create a pass pawn, as we shall see in the game. Black continued also bringing the king to the middle of the board, which is certainly the right thing to do. And White brought the king further, and so did Black by playing king e7. And this is a key moment in the game. Karpov played b4. With his last move, White blocked these two pawns on the light squares, and now those two, in addition to the pawn on d5, becomes potential target of the white bishop that is running on the light squares. And here, based on the same theme, Black made a mistake. A better move was to push the h pawn up to h6, getting out of the diagonal of the white bishop, so the knight would be relieved from defending that pawn. But instead, in the game, Hort played g6. Now all black pawns are on light squares. That means they are all in potential danger. White played g4, and you may say, but White is just doing the same, putting his pawn on the same color as Black's bishop is running on. However, White has the clear intention to advance that pawn further up to g5. And Black moved the knight to d7, and White followed by playing f4. Now White is preparing to advance that f-pawn further. And here Black played again, not the best way. The best move for black here was to move the king to d6. But instead, black moved his knight. Let's see what would happen if black would move the knight to b6 instead of f8, where Hort moved it. Here, white would continue with knight c6 check, relocating the knight to e5. So after the knight appears on c4, the king can move to d4, the knight making space for the white king on this important square. And if black captures, then we reach a bishop and pawn endgame. Now, very importantly, white would blockade these two black pawns also on the like squares. The pawn endgame after bishop f5 would be clearly lost after g3, black being in Zugzwang, meaning that after any move that black would choose, black would lose material and need to worsen their position. Let's go back a couple of moves and see what happens if black does not initiate the exchange of bishops and plays bishop to g4 instead. Then white puts the bishop in a position to attack first the pawn on d5. Black has no active plan. Bishop d1, g3, bishop f3, and bishop f1. Now black's problem is that the white bishop is about to appear on the diagonal on h3, and then from there the bishop can potentially go to c8, attacking the pawn on a6, or it can go to e6 and then to g8 and attack the base of that other pawn chain on h7. In addition to time attacking the pawn on d5. Black is unable to defend against all those three threats. He tried playing bishop g4, bishop g2, bishop e6, but now at this moment black is getting in Zugzwang, and the only thing that black can do is move the bishop hanging on to the pawn on d5, but that already allows the white bishop to get to this crucial diagonal and then appear on c8, attacking the pawn on a6, and after king b6, the e pawn is advancing and white's win is not in question. So let's go back and see what happened in the actual game where black chose to play knight to f8 instead. Black's plan is to try to trade the knights by playing knight e6. Again, white's strategy is the same, playing g5. Came king d6 and king f3. Now white's plan is obvious, preparing g2 to g4 and then creating a passed pawn by playing f5. Obviously, white would not want to play f5 immediately because after pawn takes pawn, in that case, white could only recapture with a piece with bishop or knight without creating a passed pawn. And this is where black made the losing move. Black played knight e6, making white's life much easier. A much better defense was to make kind of a waiting move with bishop d7 at this moment. The game continued with knight e6, bishop e6. And now it's going to be as similar as in that previous line that we saw where black got in Zugzwang. King e3, bishop g4, bishop d3, bishop e6. This is what happened in the actual game. Bishop g4, bishop c2, black can do nothing. Bishop e6, bishop b3. Now the bishop is pressuring the pawn on d5. Black has to keep evading moves. Bishop d1, and the bishop appeared on f3. Now, if the black king makes a evading move, then the white king enters on e5. And after the actual game move, when black played bishop to f7, then similarly to that previous line, the white bishop appears on g4, aiming to get to c8, and then the white king will be able to enter to black's position via e5, and black resigned. Let's move on to our next position that was played by a very famous player, Nimzowitsch. Nimzowitsch had the black pieces in this position against Henenberger. And this is a very typical position with a good knight versus bad bishop. What does that mean? It means that here white has a horrendous bishop that is greatly limited by his own pawns, versus the black pawns being on the opposite color of the white bishop. That means the white bishop, not only that is limited by his own pawns, has no chance to attack any of the black pawns. The black knight, on the other hand, has a number of wonderful outposts to jump to. If now black jumps to this very tempting e4 square with the knight, it's beautiful, but it's hard to make progress after that. So that is not the correct way to go. Let's see how Nimzowitsch took advantage of the situation. Brought his knight to b5. The white king needs to stay on e3 to make sure the black king doesn't get further in and get to attack the white pawns on c3 or g3. So white is pretty much limited in moving only his bishop, which he did. Bishop to d2, and came knight to a3. Now that knight aims to go to a unlikely looking square, but a good one in this case, to b1. If the white bishop would try to stay on this diagonal and go to e1, then black immediately would give a check and transpose to a only pawn endgame, but with a king entering the position, threatening to go to either d3 or f3, attacking white's pawns. And after king e2, which stops both entrance points, then very importantly, black has a little waiting move, putting white into zugzwang. And now, either way the white king goes, the black king goes the other way and wins the game. Let's go back again to the position after knight a3 and see what happened after bishop to c1. Now the knight appeared on b1, attacking the pawn on c3. The white bishop again is forced to move to b2. Moving to d2 would allow the exchange the knight for the bishop, resulting an easily won endgame for black. So the bishop moved to b2, and now a very interesting moment in the game where black is using triangling to give the right and obligation to move to white in this position. If it were white to move in this position, white would be already in serious trouble. But in the meantime, black needs to lose a move, and this is what he did. Started by playing king d6. Now, if the white king moves to f2, then the black knight would appear on d2, and then if king e2, knight e4, and the g3 pawn would be lost. Or if in this position white would play king g2, then the black king already is unstoppable from entering on e4. In the game, in this position, white therefore chose king e2, not king f2. And now the important point, not going back to d5, which would be repetition of moves, but going with the king to c6. If here the white bishop makes a waiting move to the corner, then black would respond by playing king d5, king e3, and a3, putting white in zugzwang. And after king e2, king e4. And the black king is entering. Let's go back again, one last time. After king c6, in the actual game, white continued with king e3 and resigned after king d5, because if king moves down, king e4, or if bishop a1, again a3 comes and white is lost. A cute variation is if the king would go here to f2, the knight again would appear on d2, and if the king now goes to the e file, then knight e4, as we saw before, or after king g2, king e4. In addition, another idea that black can have in such positions is to trap the bishop by playing knight b3. And if pawn takes, the two pawns, at least one of them, will promote to a queen and result in an easy win for black. After these two endgames, let's go and see a middle game position. In this position, white has quite an obvious attack against black's king. However, at the moment, black is offering a trade of queens, and if the queens would disappear, so would the attack. We'll see now how the white bishop and knight can work together beautifully. In this case, to maintain the attack by using a pin. And this is how Spielman, one of the greatest attacking players of his time, against Bogolyubov, continued the game. White played knight e4, which cannot be captured because after pawn takes knight, an immediate checkmate would arrive. Let's go back, of course. Black did not capture the knight. If black would trade queens now, the white knight would recapture with a check and at least winning the pawn on d5. Black responded by playing queen c6. And now white had the time to bring yet another piece to the attack, the rook to e1. Black still cannot capture the knight for the same reason. And played king h8. So now the white knight is in danger because after the queen f8 check, the check can be blocked. So white now gave the check with the queen. The rook cannot block because then the knight on e7 would be hanging. Therefore the knight blocked the check. And now white simply moved the knight back to g3, opening the e-file for the white rook to enter and also trying to appear on h5 to strengthen the attack. Black pawn captured on g4 and white follows very aggressively with knight h5. The knight is an extremely dangerous attacking piece. Came rook to g6, that followed by rook e7, and the white rooks are entering the 7th rank. If white could enter with another rook on f7, black could about resign. In the meantime, black captured white's pawn with a discovered check, king h1, and played bishop to g4. trying to give up the rook in the corner and then capture the knight on h5 and hang into the game, as white's king's position is quite open as well. But here white had a tactical opportunity to simplify the situation. Try to think, what should white do? And the correct move here is knight to f6, a beautiful move, leaving the queen hanging, but threatening checkmate on the next move by rook captures h7. The black queen captured on f6, rook recaptured, rook captured queen, rook captured, renewing the pin so the black knight cannot capture the rook. Came rook to g7, and now of course it's a technical win. White is already up material but needs to make some more energetic and good moves. Rook e5, putting pressure on the pawn on d5, which black protected by playing c6. And now a very important move to revive the bishop and play c4, a very important move. If white would not have rushed with that move, black could have played b5 and prevent it for the future. So it was important to do it now, while white could do it. Black played rook d7, white traded pawns and moved the second rook to the 8th rank, putting more pressure on the knight on g8, and black resigned because, for example, after the rook retreats to g7, white would follow up by bishop takes pawn, and then the knight is lost. And now I'd like to show you a very famous game, the so-called legal mate. It's a very famous little miniature game, but it probably demonstrates best the power of the bishops and the knights working together. Here is the little game. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, d6, white develops knight c3, and black makes an inaccurate move, bishop g4, making a pin. But this is one of those situations when it's a deceiving pin, because the bishop is on an unprotected square. White plays h3, and now bishop h5, maintaining the pin, is already a serious mistake that loses at least a pawn. You may know the combination here. If you don't yet, try to think and find the brilliant combination for white. And the move is knight captures pawn on e5. Here is the brilliant idea that after bishop takes the queen, bishop takes pawn, king e7, and knight d5, checkmate. Remember this picture, remember this idea, this pattern, how the bishop and the two knights beautifully, optimally work together. Let's go back just a couple of moves. I want to point out a few more things. For example, if the black knight now captures the knight, with the idea that after queen takes bishop, to capture the white bishop on c4, then black does not stay ahead for long because of the fork with queen b5 check and then capturing the knight, leaving in fact white a pawn ahead. And finally, let's see the brilliancy of the week. Wow, look at this position. Black has all his pieces still on the board, while all white has is his knight. Of course, I promise you, this is not a position that will happen every day, but nevertheless, I think it's a beautiful way to demonstrate brilliancy in chess. White to move and win. Amazingly. Even though black still has all his army on the board, it is white who wins. And here is the elegant sequence. The first check comes through f4. Of course, it's quite obvious that for now, white needs to give checks, otherwise black will start giving checks with his queen and game over. Black only has one move to make, check, and white picks up a few pieces all with checks. Lots of checks, check, check, and another check, and another check. And now it's important not to capture that pawn on d3, even though that would be a check with a check as well, but start threatening giving checkmate. Now, after king e4, white is threatening to give checkmate either via e6 or d3. So black needs to defend against that by giving a check himself and clearing the d6 square for the king. So the white king needs to go to e5 to renew the checkmate threat with the knight. Again, black needs to give a check to delay white giving a checkmate. King e6. Now there is only one checkmate threat left since the e6 square is now occupied with white's king. Came knight to d8, check, and king d7. And black ran out of checks. Look at that. And now it's game over. It's important to notice that if the same position would arise without the black pawn being on d3, which white could have captured all with checks, that would not be good because then the black pawn from d4 could advance to d3. So it was important to keep that pawn on the board. At the same time, in this position, black is helpless against the upcoming checkmate on d3. Even if black moves the rook, knight d3 is still checkmate. Hope you enjoyed this and learned a bit more about knights and bishops. Thank you for listening. Until next week. So long.